All right, good morning and welcome to our COVID-19 remote learning session that is focusing on formative assessment and evidence of mastery. So we already did introductions. Just a reminder, if you have any technical issues, please reach out to John at NVPS in the chat window. And as a reminder, this webinar is a series. And so we have 3 different webinars that are all focusing on the COVID-19 module, this COVID-19 module. On May 1st, we had one on Google Classroom. Today is on formative assessment and feedback. And we have one that's coming up on May 22nd that's actually rescheduled from last week. We weren't able to do that webinar last week. And it's going to focus on peer-to-peer discussion. So it's great to have everyone here for this one. And I hope to see you again next week for peer-to-peer. So on today's agenda, first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about why is formative assessment important right now in this context. We're going to spend some time just doing a very quick overview of the learning plan of the resource. And then we're going to dig into one part of the resource. We're going to look at the investigation and think through as a group, how do we give feedback to students to be able to support formative assessment and their building towards mastery. And then we have a little bit of time at the end for some questions and answers and reflection form. So to that end today, we're going to focus on formative assessment and thinking about how do we show evidence of progress and learning towards a learning goal. We're going to model some remote learning best practices, including a micro routine, which is like a very short, brief routine that has been adapted for the remote context. And we're going to look at a checklist, an example of a checklist that's used to provide feedback and assessment for students. And then at the very end, we have a moment to think about what are some other ways that we can help you out, including office hours or connecting with us one-on-one or getting the materials that are going to be updated on the remote learning site. So just a few agreements quickly. Please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. We love to hear your voice, but sometimes the background noise, including even in my house, I apologize in advance if we have any loud background noise at my place. So yeah, just mute your microphone while you're not speaking. Please keep another window or tab open with the participant agenda. John's going to go ahead and send you that participant agenda that was emailed to you just so that you have that open. We're going to be using some resources from that. And this one's really more for me, but it's to allow for extra wait time. Just to remind ourselves if we are going to talk, we have to unmute. It takes a minute to kind of fumble around. So just kind of being aware of that. A reminder that all these resources, the slides, the instructional materials, and hopefully soon this recording will all be available for you after the session. And with all of our webinars, just recognizing the complexity and the difficulty that we're all facing right now and all our students are facing as teachers and learners in New York City during this difficult time. So why is formative assessment important now? I mean, formative assessment is a part of our classrooms all the time, but what is unique about formative assessment in this context that we're facing? So to talk about this, we're going to use a micro routine. And I'm going to just quickly go over how this micro routine will work, and then we're going to launch into it and try to use it. So in just a few moments, I'm going to read a brief text to you, and you're going to have 30 seconds to respond to that text. And you're going to use the sentence frame, "This reminds me of." So you'll have time to think about it. Then you're going to have a minute to share your reaction in the chat. Then you'll have 1 more minute to be able to read other people's responses in the chat and respond to them. And throughout this whole process, be ready to explain your reaction or your ideas or your thoughts with the group. So in just a minute, you're going to have 30 seconds. And I just want you to think, or just keep this sentence frame in mind for yourself. This reminds me of. So assessment is often talked about as an instrumental practice related to monitoring or supporting educational achievement. If caring is thought of as a way to make yourself more susceptible to some matters than others, assessment can be a caring practice. It is a way to focus instruction on learner voice, knowledge, and relevant supports. In the process, it can support important relationship building. Analyzing student work is a very powerful process that supports teacher learning. So this is just a text, a brief excerpt from Philip Bell and Morgan Bang's Making Science Instruction Compelling for All Students. And later on, you can click on this link and read more about it. But for now, just take 30 seconds, think about this text, and be ready to respond in the chat. This reminds me of. Okay, that was 30 seconds. So I'd like for everyone in the chat, make sure you're clicking on everyone in the chat and type your response using the sentence frame, I had this reaction because, or this makes me think of. How can you react to that quote? Great, you have about 30 more seconds. If you have not had a chance yet, please respond in the chat. Great. All right, that's great. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to just ask a couple people to elaborate a little bit on their response and explain their reaction. If I ask you and you would prefer not to, just unmute yourself and say pass, and maybe next time. Otherwise, unmute yourself. And if you remember, we are recording this portion, so if you don't want your face on the screen, just click off your video. So our Begum, I might be pronouncing that incorrectly. I apologize, but I really like what you said. Could you please elaborate a little bit on that for us?
Good morning. Thank you. I think I quickly just said I just want to say from my own perspective, I think it gets me, or it just lets me an understanding of what my students, how my students are learning. I'm not paying attention what I just said, but yeah. And then it also like, so as I plan ahead, I can actually look at that, assessment, and either I gotta sometimes plan it backward or I gotta plan it forward. So that just gives me that understanding how they're learning. Mm-hmm. So in the future, I'll just plan it differently, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I liked what you're
Yeah,
saying. It just sounds very positive. It's very straightforward and positive. Reminds me my students are learning. They are progressing, and we're
right.
looking for evidence of that. They might not be exactly where you want them to be right now, but
Mhm.
they are learning, they are progressing, and it's finding evidence of that and being able to react to it, which is what I think you're also saying.
Yeah.
Be able to plan forward.
Mhm.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Kamara, would you mind sharing a little bit more about what you mentioned here?
Sure. I was talking about the socio-emotional aspect of teaching. I think sometimes, well,
Mm-hmm.
first, the word that kind of triggered me was caring in
Mm-hmm.
that piece. And so often we get so focused on the content and the content driving our classes
Mm-hmm.
that, and even though we know about socio-emotional learning, we don't
Mm-hmm.
always engage in that type of work.
Mm-hmm.
Or enfold it into what we're doing with content. So it
Mm-hmm.
just helps me to be more mindful to
Mm-hmm.
remember that, when we're caring about students, we are engaging in socio-emotional
Mm-hmm.
components as well as content-driven learning.
Great. Thank you. I like that. It's both. It's not either or. It's both. And I like how you said that it's embedded or folded in within formative assessment. Great. Thank you so much, Kamara. Um, there's a lot of great comments here, but we're going to kind of move on with this. I just want to mention that micro routine, really short, right? Something that's adapted that you could use with your classes in a synchronous way. We have a lot of different examples of them. So if John doesn't mind putting this link into the chat whenever you have time later, I would suggest clicking on this and looking at all these different micro routines that you can use. There's also on the same page, there are full instructional routines that take longer. That might be something you can do asynchronously, but there's a lot of great ideas in there to get your students to be able to talk to each other in synchronous formats. So back just to keep building on what Begum and Kamara were talking about, let's think about why are we focusing on assessment now, right? In particular in this context. And of course, the thing that always surfaces for most of us is the Regents exam, right? And that, we don't really have to worry about the Regents exam right now in many ways. We have to think about how our students, we need to be able to still show mastery of learning and we need to show progress of learning. So I think that's why assessment is such an important piece right now. It's that we have to find other ways, alternative ways to demonstrate students' learning. It's also a great opportunity because we can take more time to invest in higher quality work that gives us opportunities to, or that gives students opportunities to show their learning. And one good side of remote learning, I know there's a lot of pros and cons to it, but students don't have to complete all the work at the exact same time and in the exact same pace. I think in the classroom, we get so caught up often with like, okay, our 45-minute class period, in and out, get our work in. We get to slow down and students get to have a little bit more individualized time and attention to work at their own pace. Also, because of this time right now, we can frame assessment as a practice of care and engagement. We can use it to have conversations about what our students care about and are interested in. So we hope that the practices in this webinar today are supportive of those challenges at this specific time and being able to demonstrate caring and assessment as a caring practice. And we hope that you'll be able to help us add on to our list and our understanding of that. So before we dig into some practice around formative assessment, we're going to take just a minute to do a flyover of this resource. I think some people might have already had time to look at the resource or even trying it in their classrooms, but it also might be new to some people. So this learning plan, along with all of our materials, are available at the remotenewvisions.org site, just as a reminder. And as another reminder, all of the materials that we create are modifiable to be either synchronous, happening all at the same time, asynchronous, in their own time, in their own place, or a blended approach to learning. So as we go through this kind of 50,000 foot view of the module, which represents about 2 weeks of learning, 2 to 3 weeks of learning even, what is one specific opportunity for formative assessment you see? So let's just go through it and think through your lens for looking at this plan is what is an opportunity for formative assessment. So this plan, along with all of our modules, starts out with a launch. And if you joined me for the previous webinar, we dug into the launch activity around HIV and how this was a new virus in our lifetimes that really just emerged, right? Before our lifetimes, basically before the 80s, no one really heard very much about HIV/AIDS. And so this emerged. There was, just like COVID-19, there was a lot of hysteria and misinformation and people being scared of this disease. So we start this out because students have already heard about HIV and have a lot of background information. So this is how we surface some of students' ideas around viruses and zoonotic diseases. Then students will be launched into some work time. And there's two major assignments during the work time. One is an investigation, and we're going to look at that more closely today in this webinar, where students look at graphs and visuals and surface observations and ideas and questions about information about viral infections and zoonotic diseases. Then students have a set of resources. They have a text, they have a video, they have an embedded text, and they use a note taker to go through those resources and try to start to pull out more of the details around how zoonotic diseases really occur. And this is where we really dig into some of the content around mutations and how viruses change and can be able to jump from one organism to another. And the circumstances under which that happens and like why that's happening more frequently. Then there's some time for check-in where there's peer-to-peer or teacher to student using discussion boards, using assessment checklists, using multiple different ways in which you can interact with students and check in with their learning. And in the wrap up, there is a culminating assignment where students use a slide deck, a Google slide deck, to put in order to think about the sequence of events of what most likely happened, of why we have COVID-19 and where did it come from. And students get to choose within that slide deck the portions of the deck that they would like to explain more about based on their learning from throughout the entire unit. So I know that was really quick, and if you're not familiar with the plan, this is probably a little bit more challenging than for if you have dug into the plan. But I'd like everyone to take a moment, and in the chat window, I'd invite you to suggest one specific opportunity for formative assessment that you've seen already. Oops, sorry. There Great, thank you, Ms. Raid. That is a great idea. Exploring some preliminary data and some information just to surface what do they already know. Mm-hmm. Yep, surfacing some prior knowledge based on data in the graphs and visuals. Mm-hmm. That's a great point. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a great idea, using a Google form as one format to be able to gather formative assessment and student ideas. It's a great idea. It's good to know, I agree, Arbigum, about figuring out what do they know in advance so you can modify things. Discussion boards, great. All right, I hope I provided enough wait time there. Those are all some really great ideas. So we want to look at how do we provide feedback that is supportive of formative assessment and understanding student learning over time. And there's multiple, in this context, there's multiple formats that we can use for feedback. right? Some low-tech ways around just emailing and texting. My favorite way, which is through comments on a Google Doc. I think that's a really positive way. Google Docs or Google Slides, you can comment. Rubrics and checklists. So we're going to look at an example of a checklist together today. Comment codes, which is something new to me, that if you click on here, you can see an example that we're using in math around using very short abbreviations to stand for common comments that you would like to give to students. Instead of like constantly typing out the same comment, it's using codes to provide feedback for students. One-on-one conferences, providing models, and being able to let students know what you expect from them based on example work. So those are all different formats that we can use. But let's think about what is important in terms of how do we provide feedback and what feedback that we want to give. I think the most important thing that we've looked at in talking with teachers and looking at different assignments and seeing how things are going in classrooms is to be very strategic and really think through what are the key things that you're looking for and planning that out about where you're giving feedback. I know many teachers are being overwhelmed with a number of assignments and discussion boards that they're trying to moderate. So it's being choosy. Where are the places that you really need to intervene and give students that quality feedback so that they can move on? So less is more. Thinking about giving 2 to 5 quick comments that are focused on a specific piece of content or skill, rather than trying to address everything, right? We know students are probably going to make a lot of different mistakes in a lot of different places where they need some more support or they should do more. But I think it's about putting your effort in somewhere that's strategic, that's going to make the difference in their learning. And providing time for revision. In our first webinar, if you had joined, if anyone here was able to join us, we talked a lot about how to time and pace assignments, right? And so that giving students ample opportunities to do their work, to kind of individually struggle through their work or struggle or work through it, make sense of their work, and then providing feedback after they've had that time, and then providing even more time for them to go back and revise and use that feedback. So really making sure that we're taking into consideration how we space out assignments and feedback. And always thinking about feedback around technology. You know, our students and ourselves have different access and capability using technology. And so this list here kind of breaks down those of you who have, or those students, I'm sorry, that have low tech versus modest tech versus high. One interesting thing here I'll point out from this slide is Pear Deck. I don't know if anyone here has started to use Pear Deck, but it's an add-on that you can use in Google Slides, and it's new to me. And I definitely, after this webinar, I would suggest, if you haven't so far, check out Pear Deck, because it is a really great way of being able to provide interactive feedback to students on their work. So I'm going to stop talking here in a minute. We're going to do some practice in breakout groups using that information about feedback and those things that we've just been talking about to look at some student work to do that. So there's some resources that you're going to need for this activity, and I believe John has been busy putting a bunch of stuff in the chat for you. So, oh great, I also see some great messages about Pear Deck. That's great. So the resources for this activity that you're going to need are first the plan, which I believe John has already sent out. You're going to need the assessment list for the investigation. So we're going to look at the origin of zoonotic disease investigation activity today. You need 2 samples of work, student A and student B. These are not real student work pieces. They're composites of student responses that I've seen working with some teachers, but hopefully represents some of the things that your students might see or bring up. And you're going to need these slides. And so John should also have put in the chat window, which I see he has, group slides where you can click on it, and you're going to be able to edit the slides and put in your information from your group in the slides directly. So I know that's a lot of different stuff, so I just want to make sure, give everyone a little bit of time to make sure they have everything ready. Okay, so this is the steps that you're going to go through in your breakout rooms. So you're going to have about 12 minutes with your group, so you really don't have to rush. You can look through the resources together and figure out what piece of work, first of all, what piece of work you would like to focus on. So you have 2 pieces of student work. You can look at the work in total of one student, or you can zoom into one part. Again, that's up to you in your group what you would like to focus on. But once you've decided, go ahead and put in your slide the work that you are focusing on. So each group is going to have their own slide. So let me just show you that here. So for example, group 1, you have a slide, group 2, you have a slide, group 3, etc. Once you get in your group, you can go to your slide, add in your names for your group, and then figure out which student work you want to look at. Your second step is what feedback would you provide to the student? You might also want to look at the culminating assessment if you have not so far, because again, trying to link up earlier assignments and opportunities for formative assessment to show progress on that final piece. So what feedback would you guys give to the student? And then 3, think about a rationale or plan. So going back to those 2 or 3 slides that we just looked at together, you can click back on those and think through, use some information from those slides and your own information about feedback, about what is your rationale or plan for offering that feedback. So I want to give everyone just a minute to process. Those are kind of a lot of directions and a lot of stuff that you have in front of you. Is there anyone have a clarifying question that they'd like to ask before we send you off into your breakout room to complete this assignment? You can either do it in chat or you can unmute yourself and ask. Okay, it sounds like we're all ready to go. If at any time you're in your group out your breakout group and you guys get lost or not sure what your task is, you can message me or message John at NVPS and we can help you out. All right, so go ahead, John, send us off into our breakout groups. Okay. All right. All right, so group 1, Sintra and Maria, would one of you mind just giving us a little bit of an overview of what you guys talked about in your group and some of the decisions you made in terms of feedback?
Okay, I mean, I can do it. So we looked at student B and we went all the way down to the summary where the student had to use the evidence found in the graphs and visuals to develop an initial response. The research question was, where do diseases like HIV and COVID come from? And the student's response was, HIV and COVID-19 are diseases caused by viruses in animals. The maps show the bats carry viruses. There's a human impact and a lot of people in those places. So there are more people who get HIV and COVID, and people are around bats, so they get zoonosis from the bats. We basically discussed where in the information provided did the student come up with HIV coming from the bats. And you know, we did this really quickly, so we didn't really see anywhere in the maps any like actual data on HIV. So that's where we kind of focused our feedback, and to make sure that the student did not think that HIV and COVID is the same type of virus. Libby, you're muted.
Sorry, thank you. So this is the first investigation the students are working on in this whole sequence after the launch. And so they don't really have all the information yet. And so they might make assumptions based on what they're seeing in some of that graph and some of the data, and just also bringing in some of their prior knowledge. And we've been talking about HIV. So yes, the students could be conflating that HIV and COVID are the same, which they're obviously very different types of viruses, but they do have a similar origin, and then they're a zoonotic disease. And so that's something that it's great that you're highlighting this for kids, and that they need to tease out kind of more of the nuanced understanding of what is both similar and different between something like HIV and COVID. So I think that's great that you're kind of pinpointing kids need to really dig into this a little bit further. Did you guys have any ideas about the format you would use in terms of feedback for the student, or did you not have enough time yet to kind of think about that part of the plan?
Yeah, I don't think we really talked about that yet.
We didn't,
Yep.
no, we didn't talk about it.
Okay, no worries. All right, let's move on to the next group number 2. If anyone would like to please volunteer to share some of your thoughts from your group.
Okay, I'll do it.
I was gonna say,
Um,
Kamara, it's all you.
So yeah, I was waiting. I was like, dang it. Okay, no. So we after getting over a couple of trouble, like we had some problems trying to type into the slide. We decided that we were going to focus on that summary portion of the paper 2 because it used the answers from each of the parts of the visual text to try to explain the student's question. And the student's question, we realized that we didn't want to so much work with the student's answer as we did want to work with the student developing the question out a little bit further.
Yes.
So we started off with positive feedback. And one of my group members noticed that where the student was talking about the map, that they were able to identify portions on the map that weren't labeled on the map. And so we gave the student positive feedback for knowing where these areas were. And then we wanted to then use more critical feedback to help the student refocus on that research question. Later, we asked, how does your response relate to that research question? And we would use that as a way to launch into how to develop that student's research question a bit further, and then maybe answer again. The way that we would give the feedback, the way we deliver the feedback would be to comment directly using the comment feature on each piece of the components, like for the maps, for the visual text, for the any of the graphics. You can comment directly with the student's response. You can highlight it and then go to comment. And so that would be the way we would do that.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing. And I really appreciate the comment about starting with the positive feedback, going again back to the idea of caring. And this is an entire, the lens and the process for formative assessment is around caring for students. And I like that a lot. There is a scaffold in the handout around like where you can click on so that you can look at the different parts of a map that are labeled. So it is good that, but I have noticed some students that do take that extra step to try to make a connection and look at what countries they're talking about and others that haven't. So that's a great way to start out that feedback. I also heard when I was just eavesdropping in your conversation that you guys talked about connections and the importance of the students making connections in this part of the activity, that students are struggling with that. Like they can see some of the data, they can make some observations, they can surface a research question, but they're having a hard time making connections between things. And so I thought that might be also an interesting place for feedback to really push kids on how are they telling the story of that data, right? How are they bringing it all together and making connections between what's there and what they already know. So thank you, group. That was, thank you for sharing. So I went backwards. The last group number 3, I noticed you guys didn't have a chance to put anything in your slide, but did you guys have a comment about anything you guys discussed or some ideas that you have?
Yeah, so I just tried to do that now. So actually, I think if you close out and reopen it, you should see some of our notes and thoughts from our conversations.
Oops, it's taking a second. There we are.
Did that work?
It did.
Okay.
It's just taking me a second now to present. There it goes. All right.
Yeah, so I also loved what the previous group said about positive feedback. My school, we usually always organize our feedbacks into glows and grows. So that's something that I try to do as well. And kind of going back to what you were just saying, Elizabeth, we also thought about ways that we could kind of structure the feedback and even structure some of the materials to help provide them kind of upfront support and feedback.
So we thought that like adding the checklist to where they write the summary could help them see what they need to do. And then we also saw kind of across both student A and B, kind of making connections between those two maps was challenging. So either, you know, providing some captions to help scaffold that a little more could be really great. But something that we talked about in our group was having them get feedback on pages 1 through 5 first before they write their summary, so that we could kind of check in about where their gaps for understanding are, where we might need to reteach something or explain it or help them form those connections. Could be a more powerful way to give that feedback, and then let them use that feedback to create a stronger CRE summary.
Great. I agree with everything you guys said. I thought that was great. And not only just a creator CER, but then moving into the rest of the module and understanding more about the mutations and the virus piece and bringing in that connection for their final culminating assessment. So thank you for all of that, for those ideas. That's great. And I also I agree with you about the maps. It's something that, you know, creating that, we really looked at the maps and how to make those more accessible. And perhaps that's an opportunity for a synchronous check-in, right? It's like pausing from the whole, had some opportunity to look at those maps and look at that investigation and taking a moment with the whole class. I'm like, hey, let's look at these maps together and what are some of the things that we see.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you for those ideas. Great. All right, so we are almost out of time together. So just some final notes and next steps. Our next webinar is not May 15th, that is today, sorry. It is next Friday, May 22nd, if I have that correctly. See the support calendar for all of the upcoming webinars that we have in science and across all the disciplines. Our remote learning website is always being updated with new resources. We have a new learning modules every 3 weeks. We have living environment, earth science, chemistry, COVID-19 materials, and maybe a physics one on the horizon, but not sure. So please stay tuned. This slide is from our HR department that New Visions is hiring. So if anybody knows anyone that needs the changing schools or needs a job, New Visions is hiring teachers right now. And thank you for joining us. John is going to add the feedback form in the link. We really do read these the feedback notes and try to improve these webinars to be able to support you better. So